Welcome back to all our listeners. I'm very excited to be joined today by the extraordinary Doreen Bogdan-Martin on our podcast today. Doreen is the director of the Telecommunication Development Bureau and one of the 5 elected officials in the International Telecommunication Union, and has had a very impressive career in telecommunication. And Doreen is also the first woman to hold an elected office at the ITU. And in addition to serving as the BDT director, so the Bureau of Development, she also leads ITU's contribution to the Equals Global Partnership for Gender Equality in the Digital Age, and serves as executive director of the UN Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development. For those of you who are not aware what ITU is, it was originally the International Telegraph Union and is one of the oldest international organizations in operation today. It was founded in 1865 to coordinate telegraph signals, and its mandate evolving ever since with the advent of new communication technologies from radio spectrum use, wireless technologies, radio astronomy, maritime navigation, TV broadcasting, next generation networks, and assigning satellite orbits, as well as negotiating technical standards for the global telecommunication infrastructure. In other words, the work of Doreen and her colleagues permeates our entire contemporary technological and digital reality. However, my conversation with Doreen today is less about the work of the ITU and more about Doreen's incredible personal and professional journey. Her passion for this field has awed me since I first saw her speak at the Broadband Commission on the importance of strategic foresight and how to ensure that the return on investment in digital infrastructures puts people at the center. Doreen has and continues to work tirelessly to ensure that connectivity is a tool that promotes equality and fairness. Doreen, thank you for your incredible work, and thanks for taking the time to share your personal reflections and insights with our listeners. So let me kick off with a very basic questions, which I think most of us are quite curious about. How did your journey into telecommunications start?
Thank you, Anja. Well, so growing up, I was always crazy about science. I was passionate about chemistry in particular, but I grew, let's say, less interested in my chemistry labs in university, and I ended up dropping chemistry and sort of transitioned over to social sciences. It was my postgraduate experience, I would say, that brought me back to STEM. I was taking a class in my graduate studies in international communications, which was very focused on technology, specifically satellites. And I was really struck by the work of some of the writings of Arthur C. Clarke and the fact that 3 geostationary satellites could actually cover the world and enable people to communicate from one side of the planet to the other. And I wanted to learn more. My interest led me to an internship at the US Department of Commerce. I think in so many cases, it all starts with a good internship. And I was fortunate because I had a great internship working for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, at the US Department of Commerce, when at the time the government was reviewing its separate satellite systems policy. So this is the end of the 80s, early 90s, where there was basically no competition. There were 2 big satellite monopolies, one for maritime and one for everything else, Inmarsat and Intelsat. And the US government was looking at ways to liberalize and bring in new private sector satellite companies. And so I was really fortunate because I became part of the team that rewrote the US policy while I was finishing my graduate degree. And I really loved it. And it was partly about the technology side, but I would say it was even more about the impact that the connectivity would have on people and on people's lives. And I also think it's important to keep in mind that, of course, at this time, this was a world that was pre-mobile phones, really, pre the World Wide Web. But nevertheless, it was really an exciting time. And after 4 years in the government, I made my next professional step, which was to come to the International Telecommunications Union. As you mentioned, I lead the development arm in the union. And when I started, I was actually in the Development Bureau at the time as well, working on regulatory and policy developments and support to countries that were beginning to liberalize, privatize, and really open up their markets to the exciting opportunities that connectivity can bring. So I sort of started there in the ITU, moved on to lead the strategic planning and membership part, where I became very engaged with the United Nations, co-led the creation of the Broadband Commission, which is where you and I met, and now I'm back leading the development work. And this is such an important and exciting time for the work of the ITU as a whole, because if the COVID pandemic has shown anything, it's really the importance of being connected, and the fact that there's still 3.7 billion people out there that are not connected. I think, despite being the oldest organization out there, I think we have the most relevant mission today, which is really has never been so important.
Thank you so much. And I really agree with what you said, you know, that a good internship can make, or in some cases also break your career where you take a different course. But I think this is a very important point, and we'll get back to that later, you know, as we speak about the importance of investing in younger professionals, and especially younger interdisciplinary professionals to come into this domain. So let me, because I know that, you know, just because I did some homework on this, I know one of the sort of milestone documents that really inspired you in your career and some of your thinking around the issue of connectivity is what was called the Missing Link Report, written by this man called Maitland, if I understand it correctly. And I sort of reread it preparing for this interview and sort of reminding myself of what this report say and why it was perceived to be so groundbreaking, and probably also realizing is probably some of the findings is more relevant than ever, especially because of this issue that we're more connected than ever, and COVID-19, which we'll revisit, has accelerated that reliance upon connectivity and also the vulnerabilities that comes out of being connected at this scale and the pace that we are connected. One point that struck me in that report is especially when he speaks about, you know, the shift from public to private and from network to platforms, which we are seeing today. And he essentially speaks about the state as the catalyst to govern this domain. And when the drivers are arguably no longer the states, or at least not as forcefully as they used to be, and connectivity has essentially turned into, you know, if you may, an essential service or a basic public need, like gas and electricity and water, you know, your experience with this report, what was the shift that it brought about in the discourse, and where do you see us being now, and sort of where are we heading? I know these are very big questions, but also something that I know is very, very near and dear to your heart, this sort of bigger picture issues.
Yeah, thank you, Anja. I mean, great question, and it's such an important piece of work. So Sir Donald Maitland led this report. It was commissioned, I think, in 1982, and the report was launched in 1984. And when you think about the report, at the time there were 600 million telephones in three quarters of those telephones, of the 600 million, were concentrated in 9 countries, which is like incredible, right? And what Maitland said, what his report had called for, was that for the early part of the next century, that all of mankind should be within what he called easy reach of a telephone. So what did easy reach of a telephone mean? It meant walking distance. But what was so important is that Maitland saw very, very clearly that telecommunications and connectivity was absolutely essential to development. He even at the time talked about the link between connectivity and productivity, the link between connectivity and efficiency in other sectors, and also the link between connectivity and enhancing the quality of life in the world as a whole, but very specifically in the developing world. And he went on to talk about the importance of connectivity being fundamental to any development program of any country, and that in order for these programs to be balanced, like connectivity had to be right there, and it had to have its appropriate role. He also gave some investments at the time that in order to get to that beginning of the next century goal that he had set out, that it would take about 12 billion. And again, it's great to look back at this and kind of see where we are now. You know, back then it was analog, it was fixed line, and today it's all about the internet. And today we have half the world that's not connected. And our latest estimates show that it will take over 400 billion to actually get there with connectivity. So whose job is it? And I think that comes to your question, and definitely Maitland was putting sort of the onus on the state. I think the state governments still have a key role to play. Connectivity needs to be put on par with electricity, gas, and other essential resources. But it's not going to be governments alone that will be able to carry the burden of building out the infrastructure to connect the other half of the world. We really do need all hands on deck. We need the private sector to come forward. We even need civil society to come forward. We need innovative solutions to really get it done. And again, what's so important with Maitland's findings is that big link that he made way back when between that connectivity and overall economic and social progress. And if we don't succeed in bringing the other half of the world online, we are in 2030 going to be leaving a large percentage of the world behind. And that's not what we want to do when we think about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I would maybe also tie it to what we're trying to achieve with the UN Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Roadmap. We have a number of actions that were specified in that roadmap. I would even tie many of them back to some of the callings that Maitland had. He also stressed the importance of capacity building, which remains today a huge challenge for so many developing countries. We're seeing things like lack of digital skills as a huge impediment to connectivity. So really looking back at his work, the roadmap that he laid out, and tying it to, you know, sort of modern day pieces like the UNSG's Digital Cooperation Roadmap. And it's kind of mind-blowing to think that we still have so much work to do.
There's definitely that part, you know, and you know, it's also taking different forms. So we can't work exactly the same way as we have been doing in the past. It's also evolving, you know, the methodologies and operations and approaches and mindsets, you know, as we move forward in this important task that you're referring to. And that's really what's striking with your career, Doreen, is this historical institutional knowledge, which is very rare in a field as vast as telecommunication. As you're saying, you're interested in science, you're interested in satellites, and now seeing, you know, how this kind of the science and the satellite technology are sort of merging. And, you know, we speak about 5G, we speak about cyber, we speak about AI, and these are obviously at the convergence in a lot of these technologies, and requires us to also think about how these different governance systems converge similarly, be that also involving other actors than states or involving them. Which brings me to my next question, Doreen, which is something you often quoted on. I know you are a fierce promoter of equality and a rights-based approach in a lot of your work, you know, especially thinking about how to bring in more diverse stakeholders. There's a lot of focus on women and girls. You also have been quoted several times of saying that you believe connectivity alone will not connect and protect us. That connectivity has to be meaningful. You know, you alluded to earlier, we need to be investing in building the necessary literacy, the necessary fluency in engaging with and accessing these technologies in such a way that it also provides us with safety, and we can trust these technologies the way they are being adopted and integrated into our lives. And this is this issue around meaningful connectivity, which I don't think all of our listeners maybe have thought about. I'll be very keen to hear, to hear you unpack it, to describe that nuance when you speak about connectivity and this notion of meaningful connectivity, and how does that relate to equality in your view?
So connectivity on its own does almost nothing. I mean, it just because you brought the pipe to the village or to the home, that's not what's going to be game changing. It's all the things that you can do with connectivity. And so, yes, I use the expression meaningful connectivity, which means that the networks and the services are available, that they are affordable, and that they're accessible to the people that need them. So it's not just about a supply issue of getting the infrastructure there. It's also very much focused on the demand side, on the usage case. So to be able to make sure that communities, individuals, countries actually have what they need to be able to take advantage of connectivity, to be able to create, to be able to share, to be able to transform their lives using that connectivity. I mean, that's where it really becomes all empowering and as I said, game changing. I mean, some of the challenges, yes, we have a pretty big digital skills gap. We have connectivity available, we have coverage in places, we have even devices that maybe are not as expensive as they might be in other places, but those digital skills are lacking and the digital literacy is not there, so the connectivity is not being used. We have other situations where the connectivity is not being used because what it's offering is not interesting or useful to local communities. Maybe it's not in local languages, or it has nothing to do with local interest. So there's different we have other issues linked to maybe safety and security. Some people feel threatened and unsafe when they think about getting connected, and that's where we hope to do further rollouts of our child online protection guidelines and really help to empower people with those kinds of skill sets so that they can take advantage. I think we also have to remember that when it comes to the industry as a whole, the industry as a whole is very male dominated. So when it comes to creating the apps, to creating the equipment, to creating the solutions, those solutions are being created by part of the population and not the other part. There's a huge digital gender gap in terms of access to services, in terms of the digital skills that I already mentioned, and in terms of representation in the sector. We might talk about AI later. This is a big problem when it comes to AI, but the imbalance in representation in the whole ICT industry is really a big challenge, and we need to work on having better representation of different groups, having more diversity at the table to ensure that the technology solutions are adapted to all segments of society.
So if I can just kind of follow up on that point, that your last point is adapting, to all segments of society. I mean, fundamentally, ITU and also the work you've done in your past, and a lot of what inspired your work has also been around this issue of guidelines and creating, practical tools to help people engage meaningfully. And ITU is obviously an organization, although we're not speaking about ITU specifically in this conversation, but this issue around standards. And one thing that shocked me when I came into the standards world was not just how it's not necessarily catering to the diversity where technologies are being deployed, but also that those who are crafting standards and guidelines and other forms of tools and aids in this is still not gender balanced. I mean, I think the number which I got, about a year ago was that less than 5% of the people working in the standards world were women. And that obviously sets us up, maybe for some skewed approaches in this regards. I'm not going to ask you to comment on the numbers per se, but how do we, what is the role of standards, and how do we create more inclusive dialogues, being mindful that maybe we still have some way to go before we have a completely diverse room to engage with?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have a ways to go. The whole standard setting process is absolutely essential, and we need more diversity in the standards making process. I don't think that there's a quick fix per se. I do think that we need to bring more girls, whether it's middle school, high school, university. We need to do a better job of attracting girls to this space, whether it's in radio communications and spectrum management and engineering, or the standard side or the development side. I think we need to do a better job in trying to bring more girls and young women into the technology space.
Excellent. So I'm just going to skip or sort of move on to a slightly different topic, which you also alluded to in your introductory remark, where we are in the last month of a year that has been anything but easy. I think we can all agree on that. And COVID-19 will leave behind an historical imprint. It has also accelerated, as you mentioned yourself, our online presence and our reliance upon connectivity to continue working or receiving an education has been unprecedented. Essential services are becoming ever more focused around our digital avatars, if I may, with the opportunities and concerns, of course, that entails. Platform companies that often offer, offer us these avatars have acquired unprecedented power and access to knowledge and data about us, and rarely have the work that you and your colleagues in this field do every day been more important, and rarely have the risks that you are also tackling been so multifaceted. So I would even go so far myself as to argue that as governments and companies are under pressure from COVID-19 to transform their informational technology infrastructure, there is a risk and a growing risk that due diligence perhaps is not often looked upon as closely as it should be. Revealing many of the concerns and gaps identified in the missing link report that you referred to earlier. And what are your thoughts on the current situation? Where do you see the opportunities, and are there things that makes you feel a little uneasy about where we are and sort of moving forward?
Great question. Well, maybe starting with the last part of the question, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely exposed the urgency of getting 3.7 billion people, the other half of the world, connected. It has, without doubt, made that case in a way like nothing else could. In the wake of COVID, and to build the social and economic resilience, I think that we do need to face for future emergencies should they come. I think that we do need to work hard. I think we do need to work fast so that we can bring the benefits of digital technologies to everyone. So giving a big push to network penetration out to the unserved and the underserved, and that's going to need a huge injection of investment dollars. We know the tech sector has also not been spared as well. The infrastructure providers in particular, they've had a big hit, yet we need this investment to get to that last mile. And as I mentioned before, our estimates show that we're going to need around 428 billion to get the remaining half of the world online. And as I said, the pandemic's not going to make this task of getting this vital investment very easy. We had a panel of economic experts that we convened recently that pointed to an increase in traffic volumes that's resulted in an acceleration of capital expenditure related to the expansion of network capacity. Spending not directly related to measures to increase capacity is being postponed in some cases, especially in emerging and in developing economies. So that can be concerning, I would say. But the picture overall is not that bleak. I think we are beginning to see evidence that international financial institutions, we've heard recently from the World Bank, we're talking to the European Investment Bank, and national governments, they are recognizing the vital importance of broadband to economic recovery plans, with billions of dollars starting to be allocated to digital infrastructure investments. And I would say at least this is promising. We did hear about digital in many heads of state interventions at the UNGA. Connectivity was a big highlight at this year's G20. So in various different fora, we're seeing, I would say finally, that there is recognition at the highest levels that this is a key priority. So getting that network infrastructure is absolutely vital. But as I said before, that's definitely not enough to bridge the digital divide and put access within reach of all. So we need to do more, and we really do need all hands on deck, as I mentioned before, to ensure that digital access is a core national priority. So we need the regulators and the policymakers in the mix. We need to be looking at enabling frameworks that are also agile. We need the private sector partners to step up. We need new business models, new ways of cooperating with different market players. There's a lot to do. And I think the most important is really that leadership and that collaboration that we've seen throughout the COVID crisis, particularly in the ICT industry. We need that kind of leadership and collaboration to really continue over the months and years ahead. We set up something called Reg for COVID. So we set up this platform and we invited all stakeholders, not just governments, to tell us what they were doing. How are they dealing with their demand spikes? How are they getting connectivity out to the unconnected? And we had like 500 different inputs of actions being taken by different stakeholders to address the connectivity challenges around COVID. What we saw was lots of innovation. We saw lots of forward-looking thinking on the part of regulators and policymakers. And what we're hopeful is that this kind of thinking and the actions that were put in to solve the immediate crisis will continue in the future. I think you're right in that, you know, there could be some concerns as countries and industry. Everybody wants to move fast. So what are the steps that we need to make sure that we take so that it happens in the right way? And you know, it is a pressing, urgent need. And I think what can be done is that we just all collaborate, that we share experiences, and we try to get it done in the most efficient and best way.
No, I mean, thank you for saying those things. I think it's a very nice way of summarizing. And what I'm hearing from you, Doreen, is, you know, it's as much as, you know, we spoke about earlier about meaningful connectivity, you spoke about leadership, but also about how do you fundamentally make systems resilient? You know, how do you have this inbuilt sustainability and resilience into our system, and that as we are coming more online, it's important that investors and governments and industry and other leaders fundamentally shift their focus also to that. So we can't look at the quick return on investments, but the long-term return on investments, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So you mentioned AI earlier and the importance of AI, and obviously the theme for this project and this initiative in Carnegie is AI and equality, and both, you know, fairly large terms that you and I will not try to define either in this conversation. But I know that you played a very instrumental role, and you know, I know your work also trying to, in the initial phases of the of the UN, sort of waking up to this whole new universe of AI complexities and what AI means and what it is and how it can be used and imported and adopted, etc. You created the first map of AI-related activities within the UN. And it was quite interesting that a lot of UN people at the time sort of woke up to the fact that it was much more integrated into business operations than maybe people had thought, because we made this a bit of an abstract issue, you know, more of a science fiction trope, and not realizing that this was very much at the core of what we were doing, and therefore needed a very different type of dialogue and discussion around what that meant for the UN, but also much more importantly, what it meant for the world, which is fundamentally also the mandate of the organization you're working for and something you feel very strongly about. And, you know, equality can mean different things. And there's also this notion for good can mean different things and can be difficult to find. So when ITU and when yourself, you know, were sort of person investing in launching this discussion around AI for good, what was the thinking behind it? And, you know, now given that it's becoming, you know, part or and like bread and sort of part and parcel of what the ITU is doing in its work with member states and other stakeholders, you know, where do you see this moving forward? Not the conferences themselves, but this discussion around AR for good and what it comes to mean for us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. Maybe just going back to the conference itself, so you can get a sense of where it started. So we did the first summit in 2017, and in the planning part for the summit, we had this notion of good. So as you said, what does good mean? And so for us, good was achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So we made the direct link to the 17 goals, which meant we needed to be talking to our UN sister agencies and partners. And back in 2017, in our discussions, we attracted 20 agencies to join us. It was a first for the UN to come together on a very sort of new and emerging cutting edge topic that didn't have a mandate or fit in a particular UN committee or in one particular UN organization. So it was basically 20 agencies coming together where we started to think about, okay, what are we doing? And how are we thinking about AI in terms of our respective mandates, and how can we be thinking of AI and how it can help to be used to achieve each and every one of the SDGs. By 2018, we had 32 agencies, and we've continued to grow since then. And of course, this year, everything went virtual. Of course, it was all online, and it was the AI for Good Summit online all the time, with numerous kinds of discussions and sessions. And again, going back to the first summit, we had different agencies coming forward with things that they were kind of experimenting with, from how to use machine learning and AI to manage crops, for example, in developing countries. How to use AI in terms of nutrition, so linking it to the health SDG. The one that always I thought was so cool from the very beginning was how to use AI to detect diabetic retinopathy, something that's very hard to detect with the human eye, which was really super cool. How to use AI to predict deforestation. So, I mean, it was really incredible. And of course, you were with us from the very beginning to have different partners, to have academic institutions, to have research institutes, the private sector and governments come and look at all the things that are happening, very focused on SDGs that could bring good, that could be life-changing, that could save lives, that could help save the planet. And so from there, I would say it was born. The event in itself has certainly grown, and I think as has the importance of AI globally, with different organizations, the UN system as a whole, taking different steps in the AI space. I think the AI and data revolution is, I would say, yet to yield tangible dividends for most of the developing countries. In these countries, they often lack the necessary, let's say, preconditions from reliable ICT infrastructure and access to electricity, as well as to human capital, the enabling frameworks to be able to collect enough data to utilize AI algorithms for development. That's where we're really trying to work with partners to bridge the gap, including by publishing data and analysis on emerging technologies in developing countries. So really trying to partner with developing countries, trying to step up our capacity building to make sure that as we advance in this space, that we're not leaving anyone behind. I do want to stress, as I mentioned before, that there's a pretty big gap in terms of women working in this space. And when it comes to the development of algorithms, if maybe only 10% are being contributed to by women, I don't think that puts us in a good place. So we really do have lots more to do. I would say overall, I think emerging technologies have huge potential to improve people's lives, but they can't improve lives on their own. They really do need a development agenda that starts, and this comes back to your point about good. We need to have a development agenda that really reflects the world that we want, an agenda that's forged, I would say, in an open and inclusive manner, and with a diverse set of teams at the wheel that help to ensure that we're properly reflecting the diversity that we find in the societies in which we live.
So this is a very interesting point, because, essentially, you're speaking about this kind of cross-cultural stakeholder communities that needs to come out of it. And this is to, to balance, obviously, some of the potential for negative uses of these technologies and make sure that it actually helps us deliver, on these sustainable development goals and related benefits for people. But to do so, we need to not only invest in resilient mechanisms, we need to invest in that literacy, that meaningful way of connecting and accessing, and also, questioning the systems when that's necessary. And I think both your and my experience in our careers has been this issue around a shared conversation. And so obviously in the whole tech field, and as we know from any kind of international discussion, often there's not a shared vernacular. We can be in the same room and have one discussion, but we essentially discussing completely different things. And given, the intricacies of some of these things that you mentioned, how do you, how you related to that in your work, and how are you integrating that into, into the discussions that you're now leading on? So both you as a professional and in the work that you're doing now.
So I think, not just with AI, I would say with digital issues overall, I would say the biggest change that we're seeing, and we're seeing this as well with our membership, and I would say with the UN system as a whole, is that digital cuts across every single sector of an economy. Digital cuts across every single UN mission and mandate. And we're at this point where we're reflecting on, okay, how does it get governed? How do we deal with something that is not in its little silo? And I would almost argue that Donald Maitland saw that at the time, that telecommunications was not a silo. It was actually linked to every sector of the economy. But we've always, let's say, chosen by tradition, the regulatory policy part has been siloed. And now we're at a point where it's really cutting across every single sector, as I said, of the economy. And, how do we deal with it? What we have been advocating, and we have some great examples of some recent work that we've done, is for governments to take this whole of government approach, and to look at how they want to bring digital to their country as a whole. So we did this work in Niger to do a smart village. And again, this goes back to not just bringing the connectivity, but the meaningful part that connectivity brings. And we brought in FAO and WHO and all different UN players, so that when the connectivity was there, we could actually bring in the agriculture piece, the health piece, the education piece, and all the other pieces that go with it. So we need to really continue the discussions, the out-of-the-box thinking, bring in, let's say, cross-sectoral expertise, bring in different line ministries, and make sure that together we're kind of crafting these digital strategies that countries need to take on board so that everyone can benefit, really, so that no one is really left behind. I think it's challenging. Again, I refer to the Digital Cooperation Roadmap because it lays out, I think, the right pieces, but how you actually put it into action with so many different UN agencies holding different pieces of the mandate and so many countries having those different mandates laid out in different line ministries. So I think it's a bit of a challenge for the future, and that's where I think it's important to be thinking about collaborative practices, collaborative regulation, collaborative policy making, and to make sure that that we're all working together.
Exactly. I mean, I when I speak about this in public and especially with companies, perhaps a lot of times I get the questions of, where do we go from here? What's your guidance to us? And I've sort of been doing it a little bit like you, starting off in science and the tech space, and sort of looking at it from bottom up. And then I sort of slowly went up and I was thinking, it will it make more sense for me if I go higher up and looking more from a strategic level position? And then I went to the strategic level position. I think fundamentally, at least my takeaway from my career in this field is that you can put any fancy word on it. You can sit and have lengthy discussions about it. You can bring in people, but fundamentally it is about people and culture. And unless you get that piece right, that you understand that that's where the change needs to happen, that's the discussion that needs to happen, and those are the two core issues that need to be unpacked and what it means in that context, you're really not going to get very far. So I'm really happy that you circle back to the Maitland report where we started off, because my final question to you, Doreen, was more, you said all these interesting things about where we are and sort of like in the bigger governance piece. But as you look back and getting into this area, when it was still, like you said, a very nascent area in some ways, and we didn't have our pocket phones, we didn't have digital connectivity the way we're looking at it. What are some, if you were to take away like one or two or even three kind of main takeaways, not from the work of ITU, but your professional career that you would like to share with our listeners, especially the younger listeners coming into this field?
So I guess I would say, I feel very privileged, very lucky to have sort of started out when I did in this space. I think about going off to university, and I recently sent my children off to university, and my mother found my packing list when she sent me off to university. And there are many funny things. My kids loved it because I went off with a typewriter, and I went off with a bag of quarters so that I could make my phone call on Sundays. It was very different. And I think that young people today, they're born digital natives. And so they can't necessarily appreciate what I can, not being a digital native. And being so excited when I was a teenager when the extra long phone cord was invented so that I could actually get on the phone, go down to the basement, get away from my parents, and have a phone call with some level of privacy with my girlfriends or boyfriends. And so I remember those little advances that I thought were really life-changing. And today it's incredible because the pace of the technological change, it's unbelievable. New things are happening every day, and I think governments, regulators, and policymakers will never be able to, keep the pace with the speed of technology. But it's super exciting. I mean, definitely there's risks. You've mentioned some of them. There's security challenges. There's ethical issues. But if we can come together and try to figure out ways to leverage this incredible potential. The potential was huge when Donald Maitland thought about picking up the phone and calling someone on the other side of the planet. but the potential to have the world's resources at your fingertips through the internet, and the potential to keep online learning going for those furthest remote villages where those kids haven't had any access to education since COVID started because their classrooms were closed. I mean, the potential, it's tremendous. And I guess that's what excites me, is really the impact that this has on people's lives. But we do have so much more to do, because half of the world's people are not benefiting what you and I are benefiting from.
So maybe were you saying that this notion of meaningful impact, and the main theme of our project which is around equality, is also about really investing in understanding the differentiated impact.
Absolutely.
How it's being perceived and experienced. We experience the revolution of the phone. I remember the same as you, and sending faxes home, and being excited about the long cord, and now going with my kids to the technical museum up the road and finding the technologies I was relying upon there, making you very age conscious as well.
Yeah.
But it's not so much about the age as it is, as you said, it's also the pace of development. So being mindful about how it impacts differently, and the security is of course also experienced differently. So what makes sense for you and I in Geneva or Oslo or in New York is quite different from if you are in a more vulnerable setting, or a setting where you cannot have that same type of meaningful connectivity as you've been speaking of.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I also think that with this rapid technological leaps and bounds, that we do have to remember kind of the basics of human interactions, family relations, and things that are often impacted because everyone's into their technology. I'm quite strict at the dinner table, no phones, that whole element. We do need to keep those physical, that hopefully will resume post-COVID, but those, sort of unique communicating moments, that we don't want everything just to be virtual forever.
That's such a great note to end this super interesting conversation with you, how to nurture the human relations.
Yes.
As we're advancing quickly through this technological changes. And maybe that's back to your point on resilience. Maybe that's how we stay resilient, never ever losing sight of the people at the center that you have spoken so eloquently about your entire career.
Absolutely, and making sure that the younger generations have those values, that we can make sure that they grow up with those important values that we grew up with.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Doreen, for sharing your insights, stories from your professional career, insights from your day-to-day work. I just want to say a huge thank you to you and your colleagues for doing this with us, for the amazing work you do every day, and wishing you happy holidays. Hope you got something good and very human-centric planned for the Christmas in Geneva. So thank you so much to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.